The scent of old parchment and cold, damp stone often carries with it a certain weight, the weight of things forgotten by the sun and buried beneath the shifting sands of time. In the quiet of the night, it is easy to imagine that the map of our world is complete, that every footprint has been counted and every story told, yet history is a vast, dark ocean, and we are merely skimming the surface of its deepest trenches. There are moments in the human chronicle where entire groups of people simply vanish. They slip through the cracks of recorded events, leaving behind only whispers, echoes, and the haunting possibility that they found themselves in a world they never could have imagined. We begin our journey in the final decades of the Roman Republic, a time of staggering ambition and deep systemic unrest. The year is 55 before the Common Era. Rome is no longer a small city-state, but a sprawling, hungry dragon, stretching its wings across the Mediterranean. But even as its borders expand, the men who lead it are consumed by a different kind of hunger, a desire for legacy that transcends the mere accumulation of wealth. Among these men is Marcus Licinius Crassus. He is, by all accounts, the richest man in Rome, a figure of immense influence who has financed the careers of giants. Yet in the quiet halls of his villas, amidst the flickering lamplight and the soft rustle of silk, Crassus is haunted by what he lacks. He has the gold, and he has the political standing as part of the first triumvirate, but he does not have the one thing that grants a Roman immortality: military glory. He looks to his peers, Pompey the Great and Julius Caesar, and he sees men whose names are carved into the very landscape of the world. Pompey has swept the seas of pirates and reorganized the East. Caesar is even now deep in the forests of Gaul, weaving a tapestry of conquest that will be studied for millennia. Crassus, despite his riches, is remembered primarily for suppressing the slave revolt of Spartacus, a victory he feels is tainted, a mere police action, rather than a clash of civilizations. He craves a triumph that will rival the legends of old. He looks toward the sunrise, toward the wealthy, mysterious lands of the East, where the Parthian Empire sits like a jeweled gatekeeper between Rome and the Silk Road. The geopolitical landscape of this era is a delicate balance of shadows. To the Romans, the East was a place of infinite gold and ancient wisdom, a land where the air was thick with the scent of spices and the soil was rich with the secrets of fallen empires. The Parthians were a formidable power, heirs to the Persian tradition, masters of the horse and the bow. They were not the barbarians Caesar fought in the north. They were a sophisticated feudal society that controlled the lucrative trade routes flowing from China. For Crassus, the lure of Parthia was not just tactical. It was a siren song of unimaginable plunder and the chance to outshine his rivals once and for all. As you settle into your blankets and let the day's worries drift away like smoke, you are in the right place for a journey into the unknown. Here at the Slumber Archives, we gather these fragments of the past and weave them into stories to guide you into sleep, sharing new history narrations every single day. If you find these tales of lost ages comforting, perhaps you might consider subscribing so you never miss a night's journey. A gentle like on the video also helps others find their way to our quiet corner of the world. But for now, let us return to the dust-choked roads of the ancient world. The mobilization began with the kind of logistical gravity that only Rome could muster. Crassus was no longer a young man. He was in his 60s, an age when most would be content to retire to their gardens. Yet the fire of ambition burned with a cold, steady light. He raised 7 legions, a force of roughly 42,000 men. Imagine the sound of 84,000 sandals striking the earth in unison, a rhythmic, hypnotic thud that echoed across the Italian countryside. These were not just soldiers, they were the backbone of the Republic, men who carried their lives in their packs, their whetstones, their cooking pots, their memories of home. As they marched toward the port of Brundisium, the omens were said to be dark. The historians tell us of strange birds circling the standards and of food that tasted of ash. There is a story that as Crassus boarded his ship, a man stood on the quay crying out, "Caveat," a warning that sounded like the name of the very land he sought to conquer. But Crassus was deaf to the whispers of the gods. He saw only the horizon. He saw the gold of Seleucia and the prestige of a conquered Orient. The crossing of the sea was a transition from the known into the legendary, a journey away from the structured laws of Rome into a landscape where the rules of engagement were written in the wind. They reached Syria and began the arduous process of preparing for the invasion. The heat there is a physical weight, a shimmering veil that distorts the distance. Crassus spent his time not in the rigorous training of his men, but in the weighing of gold and the calculation of taxes, treating the campaign like a business venture. This detachment from the reality of the terrain would prove to be a quiet, creeping shadow over the entire expedition. In the spring of 53, before the Common Era, the order was finally given. The 7 legions began their trek toward the Euphrates River, the traditional boundary between the Roman sphere and the great beyond. The crossing of the Euphrates is a moment frozen in the amber of history. To the Romans, rivers were more than just water. They were sacred boundaries, the veins of the earth. As the legionaries waded through the currents or crossed the swaying bridges, they were leaving behind the world they understood. Ahead of them lay the Mesopotamian desert, a vast undulating sea of sand and scrub where the horizon never seems to get any closer. The sun beat down on their iron armor, turning their breastplates into kilns, yet they marched on, driven by the iron will of a man who believed that wealth and destiny were one and the same. There is a particular kind of silence that exists in the deep desert, a silence that swallows the clatter of shields and the shouts of centurions. It is a silence that speaks of deep time, of empires that rose and fell long before the first stone of Rome was ever laid. As Crassus led his men deeper into the territory of the Parthians, he was ignored by the local kings, who watched from the safety of their walled cities. He was being led by a guide named Ariamnes, a man who promised him a quick victory over a disorganized foe. But in the world of archaeology and ancient strategy, we often look back at these moments and see the stratigraphy of a disaster, the layers of hubris and misinformation building upon one another like sediment. The Roman military machine was designed for the heavy clash of infantry, for the solid wall of shields and the disciplined thrust of the short sword. It was a system built for the plains of Europe and the hills of Italy. Here, in the shimmering heat of the east, they were facing an enemy that was like the wind, present one moment, gone the next, leaving only a sting behind. The Parthian horse archers were already gathering in the distance, their movements obscured by the haze. They were the ghosts of the steppe, and they were waiting for the Romans to tire, to thirst, and to lose their way in the trackless waste. Crassus, however, remained confident. He dismissed the warnings of his more experienced officers, including a young Gaius Cassius Longanus, who would later play a pivotal role in the fate of Caesar. Crassus believed in the sheer mass of his legions. He believed that 40,000 Romans could walk through any obstacle the East could throw at them. He did not realize that he was no longer playing a game of numbers, but a game of shadows. He was leading his men toward a place called Carrhae, a name that would become synonymous with one of the greatest catastrophes in military history. But as we drift further into the night, we must wonder, what becomes of the men who survive such things?
when a legion is broken, when its standards are captured and its leaders fallen, where do the survivors go? The official records of Rome often fall silent after the defeat, focusing on the political fallout and the mourning of the city. But the earth holds a longer memory.
In the far reaches of the east, along the winding paths of the Silk Road, archaeologists have found traces of something that shouldn't be there, hints of a Western presence in the heart of Asia, centuries before the world was truly connected. Perhaps some of those 40,000 men did not die in the dust of Carrhae. Perhaps they were taken as captives, marched into the rising sun, and forced to serve new masters in lands where the name of Rome was nothing more than a rumour. The mystery of the lost legion is a testament to the limits of our knowledge, a reminder that even the most powerful empires are but brief flickers in the long, dark night of time. As the legions march further into the desert, the sounds of their footsteps begin to fade, blending with the whisper of the wind over the dunes. A slow, rhythmic pulse that carries them into the realm of myth. The air grows cooler now, the desert night bringing a chill that seeps into the bones. The ambition of Crassus, once so bright and burning, feels distant, like a star that died long ago, but whose light is only just reaching us. We are left with the image of the 7 legions, 40,000 souls, moving steadily toward a horizon that will eventually swallow them whole. It is a peaceful thought, in a way, to realize that even the greatest tragedies of the past eventually become part of the quiet, sleeping earth. The dust settles, the wind sighs, and the story remains, waiting for us to dream it once again. The air in the Mesopotamian basin carries a weight that is difficult to describe, a heavy dry stillness that seems to press against the skin like an invisible hand. Marcus Licinius Crassus, a man whose life had been defined by the acquisition of gold and the cold calculations of Roman politics, now finds himself leading 40,000 men into a landscape that refuses to be calculated. As the legions march deeper into the desert, the familiar world of shaded villas and marble forums begins to dissolve into a haze of shimmering heat. The Roman military machine was a marvel of the ancient world, a disciplined, rhythmic force designed for the forests of Gaul or the rolling hills of Italy. But here, amidst the endless dunes and the blinding glare of the sun, that discipline begins to feel like a burden. The heavy rectangular shields, the iron-plated armour, the thick wool tunics, everything that once signified strength now serves only to trap the heat against the body, turning every step into a quiet struggle for breath. Crassus makes a choice that will echo through the centuries, a tactical error born perhaps of arrogance, or perhaps of a simple failure to understand the terrain. Instead of following the winding path of the river, where water and shade might offer a reprieve, he strikes out into the heart of the wasteland. He is chasing a shadow, an enemy that refuses to engage in the honourable, face-to-face combat the Romans excel at. And so, the desert becomes a silent witness to a slow-motion catastrophe. The stratigraphic layers of history are often built upon such moments, small localized decisions that eventually collapse into the vastness of deep time. The Parthians are waiting. They are a people of the horizon, masters of a style of warfare that feels almost spectral to the grounded Roman mind. As the legions form their massive defensive square near the town of Carrhae, the silence of the desert is broken by a sound that resembles the low, rhythmic thrumming of 1,000 drums. It is the sound of the cataphracts. Heavy cavalry draped in scales of polished bronze and iron, their horses armoured from head to hoof. They appear like metallic statues brought to life, shimmering in the heat-distorted air. But it is not the charge of the cataphracts that breaks the Roman spirit first. It is the horse archers. The Parthian horse archers move with a fluid, haunting grace, circling the Roman square like hawks riding a thermal. They carry composite bows of immense power, reinforced with horn and sinew, capable of launching arrows with a force that defies the expectations of the Roman commanders. And then the rain begins. It is not a rain of water, but a relentless, rhythmic downpour of iron-tipped shafts. The sound is described in the old texts as a constant whistling, a soft, deadly sighing of the air that never seems to cease. In a standard battle, an archer eventually runs out of arrows, providing a window of time for the infantry to regroup or charge. But the Parthians have brought a logistical marvel with them, a train of thousands of camels laden with shimmering bundles of fresh arrows. As one quiver is emptied, another is waiting. The Romans huddle behind their shields, listening to the incessant thwack of wood hitting leather and the sharp clink of metal piercing metal. They wait for a charge that does not come. They wait for a chance to fight back, but the archers always remain just out of reach, firing even as they retreat in that famous maneuver we now call the Parthian shot. The psychological toll of this constant, distant pressure is immense. To stand still for hours under a burning sky, watching your comrades fall to an enemy you cannot touch, is a special kind of torment. The Roman legionary was trained to be a wall, but even walls eventually crumble when the foundation is eroded. The heat becomes a physical weight, a thick, suffocating blanket that makes the simple act of holding a shield feel like an impossible task. The water is gone, the shade is a memory, and the horizon offers no escape. We might wonder what thoughts passed through the minds of those young men as the sun reached its zenith. Perhaps they thought of the cool springs of the Apennines, or the damp, mossy forests of the north. In the silence between the volleys of arrows, the desert must have felt like a different planet, a place where the laws of Rome no longer held any sway. This is the nature of the lost civilizations we seek to understand. They are often defined not by their peaks, but by the moments when they were forced to confront the limits of their power. The Roman square, once a symbol of unshakable order, begins to look like a cage. As the afternoon shadows begin to lengthen, stretching across the sand like long dark fingers, the tactical reality becomes a nightmare. The cataphracts, those ironclad riders, begin to probe the edges of the Roman line. They don't need to break the square with a single blow, they simply need to wait for the exhaustion to take hold. The Romans are trapped in a paradox of ancient warfare. If they stay in their formation, they are slowly picked apart by arrows. If they break formation to charge, they are trampled by the heavy cavalry. It is a slow, agonizing erosion of hope. Crassus, watching his son Publius lead a desperate counterattack that will never return, realizes too late that he is no longer the master of this story. The gold he so craved, the glory he sought to rival Caesar and Pompey, has vanished into the dust. The desert does not care for wealth or titles. It only cares for the wind and the slow, inevitable movement of the dunes. The 7 legions are no longer an army. They are a collection of individuals, each one facing the terrifying realization that the world they knew is thousands of miles away, and the ground beneath their feet is indifferent to their survival. The arrows continue to fall, a rhythmic pulse that marks the passage of time. It is a sound that will haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives, a soft, repetitive brushing against the air, like the wings of a night bird. The Roman infantry, the iron heart of the Republic, is being bled white in a land that has no name for them. As the light begins to fail, the orange glow of the setting sun reflects off the Parthian armor, creating a spectacle of terrifying beauty. It is a moment frozen in the stratigraphy of human conflict, a point where the path of history takes a sharp, unexpected turn. The night will bring a different kind of terror, a coldness that contrasts sharply with the blistering day, but for now, there is only the heat and the arrows. We can almost feel the grit of the sand between our teeth, the salt of sweat stinging our eyes, the heavy rhythmic thrum of the heart in the ears. The story of the vanished legion is not just a tale of maps and movements. It is a story of the human spirit pushed to the very edge of the known world. And as the stars begin to peer through the haze of dust and blood, we are reminded that even the most powerful empires are but brief flickers in the long, dark corridor of deep time. The desert prepares to swallow the day, and with it, the certainty of the Roman dream. The silence that follows a battle is never truly silent. It is filled with the shifting of sand, the groans of the wounded, and the distant, mocking cry of a scavenger. But here, on the plains of Carrhae, the silence feels deeper, as if the earth itself is exhaling after a long, difficult breath. The legions are broken, scattered into the darkness, and the journey into the unknown is only just beginning. We follow them now, not as soldiers, but as ghosts, moving through the cooling air toward a destiny that will take them further than any Roman had ever dreamed of traveling, into the east, toward the rising sun, and into the mist of a legend that refuses to die. The air carries the metallic tang of bronze and the heavy, sweet scent of iron-rich earth, a scent that lingers long after the clamor of iron on iron has faded into the stillness of the night. In the heart of this silence, we find the wreckage of an ambition so vast it swallowed the men who carried it. Marcus Licinius Crassus, once the wealthiest man in Rome, a figure who moved the gears of the Republic with the weight of his gold, now lies still upon the sands of Carrhae. There is a profound irony in his end. A man who sought to buy glory found instead a debt that could only be paid in blood. The stories say that his son, Publius, fell first, his young life snuffed out in a desperate charge that vanished into the swirling dust of the Parthian horse archers. To a Roman father, this was a grief beyond measure. But in the chaos of a collapsing front, there is no time for mourning, only the cold, rhythmic reality of survival. As the Roman lines disintegrated, the retreat became a descent into a labyrinth of shadows. Crassus, lured into a parley under the guise of a truce, met his end not in a grand clash of empires, but in a confused scuffle on a dusty hillside. The legend's whisper of molten gold poured down his throat in a cruel mockery of his avarice. But the historical record, the stratigraphy of human memory, suggests a more sudden, violent end. With his fall, the soul of the army withered. It is here that we encounter a loss more devastating to the Roman psyche than the death of a general. The aquilae, the golden eagles, the sacred standards that served as the physical manifestation of Rome's divine right to rule, were seized by the Parthian cavalry. To the legionary, the eagle was not merely a symbol, it was a living god, a golden tether to the eternal city. To lose one was a mark of ultimate disgrace. To lose several was a wound to the very fabric of their identity. These icons, which had marched across the known world, were carried away into the east, disappearing into the vast, undulating territories of an empire that did not fear the Mediterranean's reach. The scale of the disaster is difficult to grasp when viewed through the lens of deep time, where centuries compress into moments. Yet, for the 10,000 Roman soldiers who found themselves surrounded as the sun dipped below the horizon, time slowed to the pace of a heartbeat. These men, the survivors of a force that had once numbered 40,000, were not executed. The Parthians, ever pragmatic and possessing a different view of human capital than the Romans, saw a different use for these disciplined, battle-hardened veterans. 10,000 men, a city's worth of souls, were gathered like wheat after a harvest. They were marched away from the familiar smells of the salt sea and the olive groves, moving deeper into the heart of Asia. We can imagine the sound of those 20,000 boots, a rhythmic, muffled thrumming against the dry earth, a sound that would continue for months as they were led toward the furthest reaches of the Parthian frontier. They were being taken to Margiana, a fertile oasis deep in the territory of what we now call Turkmenistan, a place so far removed from the Roman world that it might as well have been another planet. As they marched, the constellations shifted above them, the familiar stars of the Mediterranean sky tilting and receding, replaced by new patterns that the Romans had no names for. This transition, this slow migration of a captive army, marks a peculiar moment in the archaeology of human movement. We often think of history as a series of borders and clear-cut battles, but the reality is more fluid, more like the shifting sands of the Silk Road itself. These 10,000 men represent a sudden, massive injection of Western culture and genetics into the East, a ghost legion drifting through the veins of a continent. What did they think, these men of the sun-drenched Italian hills and the damp forests of Gaul, as the landscape flattened into the endless steppe? The air grew thinner, the winters sharper, and the horizons wider than anything their poets had ever described. They were no longer soldiers of a conquering republic. They were something else, something rare. They were witnesses to the vastness of the world, moving through the periphery of civilizations that were, even then, beginning to trade silk and spices through a network of intermediaries. The Parthians settled them on the eastern borders to serve as a buffer against the nomadic tribes of the north. It is a recurring theme in the history of empires, using the strength of the conquered to protect the edges of the realm. And so the legionaries began a new life, building fortifications and tilling soil that had never known the Roman plough. As the years passed, the memory of Rome must have begun to feel like a dream, a half-remembered story told by old men around a fire. The precise geometry of the Roman camp, the strict hierarchy of the centurions, the familiar taste of watered wine, all of it began to blur into the local customs of the Margianan oasis. They took wives from the local populations. They learned the tongues of the East. They watched their children grow up in a world where the name of Caesar was unknown. Yet somewhere in the marrow of their bones, the discipline remained. The way they stood, the way they organized their villages, the way they looked toward the west when the wind blew cold. Archaeologists look for traces of this presence in the soil, perhaps a fragment of a Roman buckle, a coin with the faded face of a long-dead consul, or a peculiar way of laying stones that suggests the hand of a Roman engineer. But the earth is a jealous keeper of secrets. Over 2 millennia, the mud-brick walls of their settlements have dissolved back into the dust, leaving behind only the faintest whispers for those who know how to listen. We look at the genetic markers of the people living along these ancient routes today, searching for the ghost of a Roman legionary in the curve of an eye or the structure of a jawline. It is a search for a needle in a haystack of centuries, a pursuit of a shadow that may have long since merged with the light. The loss of the 10,000 was a trauma that Rome would not forget. For decades, the Roman public remained obsessed with the fate of their lost brothers and the recovery of those stolen eagles. It became a matter of national honor, a lingering ache in the heart of the empire. But while the politicians in Rome debated and the poets lamented, the men themselves were simply living, surviving on the edge of the known world. They were the first true bridge between the West and the East, not as traders or diplomats, but as a living fragment of one world transplanted into another. The story of the Lost Legion is a reminder of the limits of our knowledge. We see the grand movements of history, the rise and fall of dynasties, the shifting of borders on a map. But we often lose sight of the individuals, the 10,000 stories that were carried east into the rising sun. Each man was a library of experiences, a vessel of Roman culture that was slowly poured into the vast ocean of the Silk Road. As they marched, they were not just prisoners, they were the unintended explorers of a frontier that Rome would never officially conquer. And so, we leave them for a moment in the oasis of Margiana as the twilight deepens over their new homes. The sound of the evening breeze through the poplars is different here than it was in the gardens of Rome, but the stars, though shifted, still watch over them with the same ancient, indifferent light. The journey of the golden eagles was over, their glitter dimmed by the dust of the east, but the journey of the men who followed them was only entering a new, more mysterious phase. They were becoming part of the landscape, part of the deep time that swallows all things, waiting for a future where their story would be rediscovered, piece by piece, in the fragments of a world that had forgotten they ever existed. The silence of the desert is not an empty silence. It is a silence filled with the echoes of 10,000 voices whispering across the ages, telling a tale of loss, of endurance, and of a destination that lay far beyond the reach of any map. The sound of iron chains clinking against one another is a rhythm that eventually fades into the subconscious, becoming as steady and unremarkable as the beating of a heart. For the 10,000 survivors of the disaster at Carrhae, the world had narrowed to the width of the dusty track beneath their sandals and the swaying backs of the Parthian horses ahead of them. They were no longer the proud vanguard of a republic. They were a river of human grief, flowing slowly away from the setting sun and into the deep, amber light of the east. As they marched, the familiar Mediterranean world began to dissolve behind them. The scent of salt air and the sight of olive groves replaced by the dry, metallic tang of the high plateaus and the endless, rolling waves of the steppe. To a Roman soldier, the edges of the map were supposed to be defined by the reach of their own spears, but now they were being led into a geography that defied their understanding of space and distance. The Parthian Empire was not a single wall or a fixed boundary, but a vast, breathing expanse of cultures and kingdoms, and the captives were being pulled into its very center. The march toward the capital at Seleucia was not a hurried one. Time in this part of the world seems to move with a different gravity, heavy and slow, like the silt of the Tigris. The Parthians were a people of the horse and the bow, masters of movement and masters of utility, and they looked upon their captives not merely as trophies of war, but as a rare and valuable resource. In the ancient world, military skill was a currency as precious as gold or silk. The Romans possessed a specific kind of knowledge, a discipline of the shield wall, and a mastery of siegecraft that was unknown in the far-flung reaches of the Parthian domains, and so a decision was made by the Parthian king, Orodes II, that would change the course of these men's lives and perhaps the genetic history of a continent. Rather than selling them into the anonymity of the slave markets or executing them as a warning to Rome, he chose to preserve them. He saw in these broken legions a tool that could be repurposed. He would send them to the furthest edge of his world, a place where their loyalty to a distant, crumbling republic would matter far less than their instinct to survive. The destination was a place called Margiana. To the Romans, it was a name that sounded like a myth, a shadow on the edge of the known world. In our modern tongue, we know it as the Oasis of Merv, located in the heart of what is now Turkmenistan. It was a journey of over 1,500 miles from the battlefield, where they had lost their freedom, a distance so vast that it is difficult for the modern mind to grasp the sheer physical endurance required to complete it. As the months turned into seasons, the captives crossed the Zagros Mountains, where the air grew thin and cold, and the stars seemed to hang lower in the sky, brighter and more alien than any they had seen from the hills of Italy. They passed through the great salt desert, a white shimmering void where the heat distorted the horizon into impossible shapes, and finally they reached the fertile crescent of the Murghab River. Here, in the remote northeast of the empire, the Parthians faced a constant threat from the nomadic tribes of the north, the Huns and the Saka, who moved across the plains like shadows. The Romans were to be the new wall. They were relocated to this lush, isolated oasis to serve as a frontier garrison, a buffer against the chaos of the wild steppe. It was a strategic masterstroke. The Parthians took their greatest enemies and turned them into their most disciplined protectors, placing them in a cage made of distance and desert. Imagine the first nights in Margiana, the Roman soldiers sitting around fires that burned with unfamiliar wood, looking out at a horizon that held no promise of home. They were men of the West, trained in the logic of the forum and the geometry of the legionary camp, now standing watch over a silk road that was only just beginning to pulse with the commerce of a hemisphere. They were surrounded by the architecture of the East, domed structures of sun-dried brick and intricate irrigation canals that turned the desert into a garden of melons and grapes. The stratigraphy of this region, the layers of earth that archaeologists carefully peel back like the pages of a book, tells a story of constant reinvention. Beneath the sands of Turkmenistan lie the remnants of cities that were once the largest in the world, places where Greek, Persian, and Central Asian influences swirled together in a slow cultural dance. The Romans were dropped into this melting pot, and as the years passed, the sharp edges of their identity began to soften. There is a certain silence that settles over a people when they realize they will never go home. It is not necessarily a silence of despair, but one of adaptation. They began to build. They used their Roman engineering to reinforce the mud-brick walls of the oasis, perhaps adding the distinct, sturdy masonry techniques they had learned in the labor camps of the Mediterranean. They began to speak the languages of their captors, the harsh, melodic tones of Parthian and the local dialects of the Silk Road, blending them with the Latin that they whispered to one another in the dark. Did they still dream of Rome? Did they tell their children, born to local women of the oasis, about the 7 hills, or the smell of the Tiber after a summer rain? The records are thin, lost to the erosion of time and the shifting sands of the Karakum desert. But we know they stayed. We know they survived. In the deep time of the Silk Road, 1,500 years is but a moment, yet for these men it was an eternity of displacement. They were the first true bridge between two worlds that had no idea the other existed in such complexity. As they settled into their new roles as border guards for a foreign king, the Roman prisoners became a living ghost story. Back in Rome, rumors of their survival would occasionally drift through the markets and the Senate, whispered by traders who had ventured far to the east. But for the men in Margiana, Rome was becoming a dream, a fading memory of a life lived by different men in a different age. They were now the watchers at the gate, the silent sentinels of a frontier that stretched toward the unknown reaches of China. The Parthians had given them a choice, to die as prisoners or to live as soldiers once more. And in the heart of the desert, where the wind howls through the ruins of forgotten empires, the choice was simple. They chose the shield. They chose the spear. And in doing so, they stepped off the map of history and into the realm of legend, waiting for the day when their footprints would be found again, thousands of miles from where they began. The sound of iron striking iron echoes differently in the dry heat of the Margiana oasis, a sharp, brittle ring that carries across the dunes of the Karakum desert. In this remote corner of the world, near the modern city of Mary in Turkmenistan, the survivors of the Battle of Carrhae found themselves in a landscape that felt like the very edge of the earth. They were approximately 1,500 miles from the Mediterranean, separated from their homes by the vast, impassable bulk of the Parthian Empire and the unforgiving salt flats of the Iranian plateau. Here, the Murgab River spills out into the sand, creating a lush, green pocket of life surrounded by a sea of dust. For the Roman legionaries, this was to be their new home, a frontier outpost, where they were tasked with guarding the eastern flank of the very empire that had defeated them. The Parthians were clever strategists. They knew that these Romans were among the finest heavy infantry in the known world, and rather than letting such talent rot in a dungeon, they transplanted them to the periphery. In Margiana, the Romans were placed as a buffer against the nomadic tribes of the north, the fierce horsemen who frequently raided the sedentary civilizations of the Silk Road. It is a strange thing to imagine a man born on the banks of the Tiber, who perhaps grew up dreaming of the Forum and the cool shade of an Italian olive grove, now standing watch atop a mud-brick rampart, staring out at the endless, shifting horizons of Central Asia. As the months turned into years, the sharp edges of their Roman identity began to soften. The heavy woolen tunics and leather sandals of the Mediterranean were ill-suited for the extremes of the steppe, where the summers burn with a relentless white heat and the winters bring a bone-chilling frost that turns the breath to ice. Slowly, the legionaries would have adopted the local dress, the loose-fitting trousers of the East, the felt hats and the sturdy boots of the nomads. Their diet shifted as well. The wine and olive oil of home were replaced by fermented mare's milk and the hardy grains of the oasis, yet historical whispers suggest they clung to what they could. They likely maintained their rank structure and their discipline, for in a land so foreign and so far from any hope of rescue, the familiar rhythm of military life was the only thing keeping the void at bay. Life in Margiana was a study in cultural isolation. The Romans were a small island in a vast sea of Persian and Scythian influence. They were surrounded by languages they did not understand and gods they did not recognize. While the Parthians allowed them a degree of autonomy in their garrison life, the men were essentially ghosts. To Rome they were dead, casualties of a disastrous campaign that the Senate preferred to forget. To the Parthians they were a useful tool, a living wall of shields at the end of the world. They married local women, perhaps from the Sogdian or Bactrian communities that moved along the trade routes, and a new generation began to grow. Children who spoke Latin with a thick Eastern lilt, born into a world that their fathers could never have envisioned. The integration was not merely physical, but spiritual. In the quiet hours of the evening, when the desert wind settles and the stars emerge with a clarity unseen in the humid air of Italy, these men must have wondered about the nature of their fate. They were living in a liminal space, a bridge between the West and the East that had not yet been fully mapped. They were the first Romans to see the caravans of the Silk Road in their true density, the long lines of Bactrian camels laden with silk, spices, and lapis lazuli, moving toward the sunset they would never follow themselves. They were the silent witnesses to the birth of global trade, stationed at a crossroads where the destinies of empires were quietly being woven together. As time stretched into decades, the records of these men began to thin. In the year 36 before the Common Era, the Parthian administrative accounts mention them less and less frequently. It is as if they were being absorbed by the landscape itself, fading into the dust of the oasis. There is a profound mystery in this disappearance. A group of 10,000 men does not simply vanish without a trace, and yet, in the official histories of the Parthian king Orodes II and his successors, the Roman garrison at Margiana slips into the shadows. Did they perish in a forgotten war against the northern nomads, or did they find another path, a way further east, lured by the promise of a different life or forced by the shifting tides of Central Asian politics? Archaeology tells us that the Margiana region was a place of constant flux. Stratigraphy, the study of the layers of earth deposited over time, shows us that cities in this region were often built, destroyed, and rebuilt with dizzying frequency. Beneath the sand lie the remains of fortified walls and irrigation canals that speak of a highly organized society, but finding the specific footprint of a Roman legionary is like looking for a single drop of water in a storm. Their armor would have been repaired with local materials, their weapons would have been reforged. Their very bones, buried in the alkaline soil, would have long since crumbled into nothingness. There is a certain melancholy in the thought of these men, the last remnants of Crassus's ambition, watching the sun set over the Hindu Kush. They were the farthest flung representatives of a republic that was, at that very moment, collapsing into the fires of civil war under Julius Caesar and Pompey. They knew nothing of the rise of Augustus or the birth of the Roman Empire. To them, Rome was a frozen memory, a place of marble and sunlight that existed only in the stories they told their children. They were pioneers of a sort, though they never asked for the honor. They were the first to feel the immense scale of the Asian continent, the first to understand that the world was far larger and far more complex than the maps of the Mediterranean scholars suggested. Meanwhile, as the first century before the Common Era drew to a close, a new power was rising even further to the east. The Han Dynasty of China was expanding its reach, pushing its borders into the western regions in search of the legendary heavenly horses of Fergana. The gap between the Roman world and the Chinese world was narrowing, and the men at Margiana were standing in the very space where those two titans would eventually brush against one another. It is here that the trail grows cold, and the story takes a turn into the truly extraordinary. Some historians suggest that the Roman soldiers did not stay in Margiana forever. There are accounts in Chinese chronicles, the Book of Han, that describe a strange group of warriors encountered by a Chinese general named Chen Tang during a campaign in the Sogdian plains. These warriors were said to use a fish-scale formation, a tactic that bore a striking resemblance to the Roman testudo, where shields are locked together to create an impenetrable shell. They were also noted for building a double palisade of wood, a quintessentially Roman method of fortification, unknown to the tribes of the East. If these were indeed the survivors of Carrhae, or perhaps their sons, it means they had travelled even further, another 1,000 miles across the high mountain passes and the burning basins of the Tarim. It would mean they had crossed the Pamir Mountains, the roof of the world, moving toward a destiny that would place them in the service of the Han Emperor. The silence of the Parthian records after 36 before the Common Era might not be the silence of death, but the silence of a departure. They may have simply marched out of the oasis one morning, their eagle standards long lost, their armor patched with silk and leather, heading toward the rising sun. The mystery of the Margiana frontier remains one of the most haunting what-ifs of ancient history. It challenges our understanding of how connected the ancient world truly was. We often think of the past as a series of isolated pockets, but the story of the Lost Legion suggests a world of incredible mobility and endurance. As we look back through the lens of deep time, we see that the boundaries we draw between civilizations are often porous. The legionaries were not just soldiers, they were unwilling ambassadors, carrying the seeds of the West into the heart of the East, only to be swallowed by the sheer vastness of the journey. Tonight, as the wind moves across the ruins of Merv, it carries the same dust that those men once brushed from their brow. The river still flows, the stars still keep their silent vigil, and somewhere, buried deep beneath the silt of 2,000 years, the truth of their lives remains, waiting for the moment when the earth decides to give up its secrets. For now, they remain part of the landscape, a ghostly presence in the long, slow story of the Silk Road, forever marching toward a home they would never see again. Across the vast, undulating grasslands of the eastern horizon, a different kind of power was beginning to stir, its roots reaching deep into the yellow earth of the central plains. While the shadows of the west were long and filled with the ghosts of fallen kingdoms, the east was awakening with a rhythmic, measured pulse. Under the reign of Emperor Wu, the seventh ruler of the Han Dynasty, the world was no longer a collection of isolated valleys and walled towns. It was becoming a vision of grand, interconnected design. Emperor Wu was a man who looked at the horizon and saw not a boundary, but a beginning. He was a sovereign of immense ambition, a poet king who understood that for an empire to endure, it must breathe, and to breathe, it must expand. The Han Empire was a marvel of administrative precision, a society governed by the brushstroke of the scholar as much as the edge of the blade, but this order was constantly tested by the shifting winds of the north. For centuries, the Xiongnu Confederation, a formidable collective of nomadic warriors who moved like the grass itself, had been the silent terror of the frontier. They were a people of the horse and the bow, masters of a fluid warfare that the structured Han legions found difficult to pin down. The Xiongnu did not build cities, they built legacies of movement, appearing and vanishing, like a sudden storm over the steppe. To Emperor Wu, they were more than just a military threat. They were a barrier to the destiny of his people, a wall of flesh and hoof that stood between China and the mysteries of the West. As the years passed, the emperor realized that the key to defeating his rivals lay not just in steel, but in the soft threads of silk and the hard hooves of the heavenly horses rumored to exist in the distant Fergana Valley. This was the birth of a strategic obsession. The Silk Road was never merely a path for merchants. It was a vein of gold and shadow, a geopolitical lifeline that promised to bring the wealth and wisdom of the unknown world to the gates of Chang'an. The Han expansion was a slow, deliberate crawl across the Gansu corridor, a narrow passage of habitable land squeezed between the towering Kilian mountains and the unforgiving wastes of the Gobi Desert. With every mile gained, the Han built watchtowers and garrisoned outposts, stitching the landscape together with a thread of human presence that refused to be broken. The stratigraphy of these ancient outposts reveals a life of quiet, disciplined endurance. Beneath the desert sands, archaeologists have found wooden slips, the precursors to paper, covered in the elegant, functional script of Han bureaucrats. These slips record the mundane details of life on the edge of the world, the rations of grain, the condition of weapons, and the long, lonely wait for orders from a capital that felt a lifetime away. It is in these fragments of discarded history that we see the true cost of empire. It was built by men who lived in the silence of the wind, watching the northern sky for the smoke signals that would warn of a Xiongnu raid. They were the architects of a new world, standing on the precipice of a deep time they could not yet comprehend, unaware that their footprints would one day be studied as the markers of a lost age. In this climate of high stakes and shifting sands, a figure emerged who would bridge the gap between myth and history. General Chen Tang was a man of calculated risks, a soldier who understood that the survival of the Han depended on bold, often unauthorized action. While the imperial court in the east was often entangled in the slow-moving gears of diplomacy and tradition, Chen Tang was a man of the frontier. He saw the western regions not as a series of distant problems, but as a singular chessboard where the fate of the dynasty would be decided. The Xiongnu had fractured, and one of their most powerful leaders, the Chanyu Zhizhi, had retreated far to the west, building a fortified city on the banks of the Talas River in what is now modern Kazakhstan. Chen Tang knew that as long as Zhizhi remained a power in the west, the Silk Road would never be truly secure. In 36, before the Common Era, without the explicit permission of the emperor, he assembled a diverse force of Han soldiers and allied auxiliaries. It was a journey of over 1,000 miles through some of the most treacherous terrain on earth, crossing high mountain passes where the air grew thin and cold, and traversing salt flats that burned under the midday sun. This was a march into the deep unknown, a venture that pushed the limits of Han logistics and human endurance. Chen Tang was not just chasing a rebel leader, he was chasing the very edge of the world, moving toward a confrontation that would spark one of history's most enduring mysteries. As the Han forces drew closer to the fortress of Zhizhi, they observed something that defied their understanding of steppe warfare. The scouts returned with reports of a peculiar formation of infantry.
men who fought not with the fluid chaos of the nomads, but with a rigid mathematical precision. They described shields locked together like the scales of a fish scale formation that created an impenetrable wall of wood and bronze. To the Han, who were accustomed to the light cavalry of the north, this was an alien sight. It was a glimpse of a different tradition, a shadow of a distant power that had somehow drifted across the vastness of Eurasia to take root in the soil of Central Asia. The Battle of Zhizhi was a collision of worlds. The Han, with their powerful crossbows, the pinnacle of ancient military technology, rained bolts down upon the defenders, while the mysterious infantry held their ground with a stoicism that felt strangely familiar, yet entirely foreign. The air was filled with the scent of ozone and dry earth, the sound of iron meeting wood echoing across the river valley. When the fortress finally fell and the dust of the conflict began to settle, the Han found themselves in possession of more than just a victory. They found survivors, men who did not speak the languages of the steppe, men whose features and discipline suggested a heritage far to the west, perhaps even beyond the reach of the Silk Road itself. General Chen Tang, ever the pragmatist, did not execute these survivors. Instead, he saw in them a value that transcended the immediate conflict. He saw a people who knew the secrets of a different kind of warfare, a people who could be integrated into the vast, absorbing machine of the Han Empire. And so, these mysterious warriors were marched eastward, back toward the heart of China, to a place where they would be given a home and a new purpose. They were settled in a frontier town that would come to be known by a name that still whispers to us through the centuries, Liqian. In the quiet moments of the evening, when the wind dies down and the stars begin to flicker over the ruins of the western gates, one cannot help but wonder about the thoughts of those men as they walked toward the rising sun. Did they feel the weight of their own displacement? Did they recognize the Han as a mirror of the empire they had lost, another great power obsessed with order, law, and the mastery of the earth? The Silk Road was a bridge, but it was also a labyrinth, a place where identities were forged and forgotten in the span of a single generation. As the Han Dynasty continued its westward push, it was not just expanding its borders. It was absorbing the fragments of a broken world, weaving the stories of lost legions into the grand golden tapestry of its own history. The expansion under Emperor Wu and the decisive actions of Chen Tang ensured that the Silk Road would remain a conduit for more than just goods. It became a river of human experience, a path where the deep time of the East met the fading echoes of the West. The mystery of the vanished legion is not just a question of genetics or archaeology. It is a reflection of the profound interconnectedness of our species. Even in the ancient world, the walls we built were never high enough to stop the flow of ideas, of blood, and of the restless human spirit. As the Han banners fluttered in the western breeze, the stage was set for a story that would baffle historians for 2 millennia, a story of men who crossed the world only to find that, in the end, every road leads to a new beginning. The earth holds these memories in its silent layers, in the radiocarbon of charred wood and the stratigraphy of collapsed walls. We look back through the haze of 2,000 years, trying to catch a glimpse of those fish-scale shields in the morning light.
We listen for the sound of their boots on the dry earth, a steady, rhythmic beat that once echoed from the hills of Rome to the deserts of China. They are gone now, dissolved into the vastness of the landscape, but the questions they leave behind remain as vivid as the silk that once travelled those same lonely paths. Who were they? What did they dream of in the cold nights of the Gobi? And how much of our own history is built upon the forgotten footprints of those who simply vanished into the light? The scent of dry pine and old iron carries on the wind, a sharp reminder that history is not merely a collection of dates, but a series of moments experienced by men who felt the same chill of the evening air that we do today. In the year 36 before the Common Era, The vast rolling steppes of what is now modern Kazakhstan became the stage for a confrontation that defied the geographical logic of the ancient world. Far to the east, the Han Dynasty was expanding its reach, its generals pushing deep into the western regions to pacify the nomadic tribes that threatened the stability of the Silk Road. It was here, at the siege of Zhizhi city, that the Chinese chroniclers recorded something truly peculiar, a site that did not belong in the heart of Central Asia. As the Han soldiers approached the earthen walls of the fortress held by the Xiongnu chieftain Zhizhi, they observed a body of infantry stationed outside the city gates. These were not the loose, mobile horsemen typically found on the steppe, nor were they the familiar levies of the local kingdoms. The Chinese records, preserved in the Book of Han, describe more than 100 of these foot soldiers drawn up in a curious formation, a tactic they called the fish scale formation. To a scribe in the imperial court of China, the sight of shields overlapped so tightly that they resembled the scales of a great silver carp was a marvel of discipline and geometry. But to a modern historian, this description evokes a much more specific image, the Roman testudo, or the tortoise, where soldiers locked their rectangular shields together to create an impenetrable shell against incoming arrows. One must wonder what the Han archers thought as they loosed their shafts, only to watch them clatter harmlessly against a wall of interlocking wood and bronze. These mercenaries stood their ground with a stoic patience that suggested years of professional drilling, a standard of military life that was the hallmark of the Roman legions. The mystery deepens when we look at the fortifications themselves. The Han chronicles note that Zhizhi city was protected by a double palisade of wood, a defensive structure consisting of 2 parallel rows of sharpened stakes with earth packed between them. This specific method of engineering was not a feature of Chinese or nomadic warfare. It was, however, the standard way a Roman legion fortified its camp while on the march. As the years passed, the memory of this battle faded into the dusty archives of the Han bureaucracy, yet the details remain like ghosts in the text. The fish scale formation and the double palisades suggest a presence that should not exist, a pocket of Roman influence thousands of miles from the Mediterranean. How did these men, if they were indeed the lost remnants of Crassus's defeated army from the Battle of Carrhae nearly 20 years earlier, find their way into the service of a nomadic chieftain? Perhaps they had survived the brutal marches through the Parthian Empire, sold and resold as elite slaves, their only value lying in the strange, disciplined art of war they carried in their muscle memory. They would have been older men by the time they reached the walls of Zhizhi, veterans of a world they could no longer reach, teaching their sons how to hold a shield and how to dig a trench in the Roman fashion. The siege was fierce, and the Han records tell us that the city eventually fell. The fate of these mysterious mercenaries becomes even more intriguing at this point. Instead of being executed as rebels, the chronicles suggest that about 140 of these foreign soldiers were taken alive and moved to the eastern frontier of the Chinese Empire. They were settled in a specially created district, a place given a name that reflected their origins. Liqian. In the ancient Chinese tongue, Liqian was the word used to describe the Roman Empire. The silence of the steppe is vast, and it swallows the echoes of clashing steel with a cold indifference. We are left to piece together these fragments of stratigraphy, the layers of human movement that settle one upon the other like silt at the bottom of a deep lake. Was Liqian a Roman colony in the heart of China? The possibility lingers in the air, a quiet question that challenges our understanding of how interconnected the ancient world truly was. These men, far from the marble forums and the humid air of the Tiber, may have looked out over the yellow earth of the Gansu province and saw, for a fleeting moment, the ghosts of the home they would never see again. In the quiet of the night, one can almost hear the rhythmic thud of the wooden stakes being driven into the ground, the sound of a double palisade rising in a land where such things were unknown. It is a reminder that the boundaries we draw on maps are often ignored by the winds of fate and the wandering feet of those who have lost everything but their discipline. The fish scale formation was more than just a tactic. It was a signature, a thumbprint left by a civilization that had touched the edge of the world and then vanished into the golden haze of the Silk Road. As we look back through the lens of deep time, we realize that the gaps in our knowledge are as significant as the facts we hold certain. The Han scribes wrote what they saw, capturing a moment of cultural collision that seems almost impossible. They did not know of Rome as we do. They knew only of a strange, brave people who fought in a way they had never seen. And so, the legionaries of Liqian remain suspended in a state of historical twilight, part fact, part legend, forever marching through the periphery of our understanding. The earth holds its secrets closely, burying the iron sandals and the rusted pilum heads beneath centuries of dust and new growth. But the story of the fish-scale shields persists, a testament to the endurance of the human spirit and the strange paths that lead us into the unknown. We are all, in a sense, wandering through a landscape of forgotten footprints, trying to find the rhythm of a march that ended long ago. The shadows of the double palisades still stretch across the desert in the mind's eye, marking the place where two worlds met, looked upon each other with wonder, and then turned away into the gathering dark. Deep in the archives of the Han Dynasty, within the ink-brushed scrolls of the Book of Han, there is a curious entry that feels like a ripple in a still pond. A brief mention of a place that should not, by all accounts of geography or logic, exist where it does. Following the defeat of the strange shield-bearing soldiers at the Battle of Zhizhi, the Chinese authorities did not simply discard their captives. Instead, the Emperor Yuan saw something in these men, perhaps a discipline he admired, or a utility he could harness for his own expanding borders. They were marched further east, deep into the heart of the Gansu province, where the jagged teeth of the Kilian mountains bite into the sky, and the Gobi Desert begins its long, silent expanse. Here, in the year 36, before the Common Era, a new frontier settlement was established. Its name was recorded as Liqian. The name itself is a whisper from a distant world, a linguistic bridge stretching across thousands of miles of mountain and sand. To the scholars of the Han court, Liqian was not a random collection of syllables. It was their specific transcription for the Roman Empire, or more accurately, for the great western metropolis of Alexandria. In the ancient Chinese worldview, the far west was a place of myth and power, often referred to as Da Qin, but the specific phonetic rendering of Liqian was reserved for the Roman world itself. To bestow this name upon a small, dusty village on the edge of the Hexi corridor was an act of profound recognition. It was as if the Chinese officials were acknowledging that the men they had settled there were not merely barbarians from the north, but representatives of a different, parallel civilization, a world they had heard of in rumors, but had never truly touched until now. Imagine these soldiers, if they truly were the survivors of Crassus's lost legions, arriving at this remote outpost. They had travelled further from home than any Roman in history, crossing the Tigris, the Oxus, and the high plateaus of Central Asia, only to find themselves at the very feet of the Celestial Empire. The landscape of Liqian is one of harsh, haunting beauty. The wind there carries the scent of dry earth and ancient dust, a constant low moan that fills the ears and settles in the bones. It is a place where the horizon seems to go on forever, a vast, tawny sea of gravel and scrub. For men raised in the sun-drenched hills of Italy or the Mediterranean coast, this must have felt like the very edge of the universe, a purgatory of light and wind,
where the familiar stars were the only things that remained of their former lives. As the years passed, the settlement of Liqian took on a character unlike any other village in the province. While the surrounding communities followed the traditional patterns of Chinese life, this outpost remained an anomaly, a pocket of the west tucked into the folds of the east. The Han government gave these foreigners land and a purpose. They were to serve as a buffer, a border guard against the nomadic incursions that constantly threatened the Silk Road. In this way, the legionaries became mercenaries once more, trading their labor and their lives for a place to exist. They were no longer invaders or conquerors, but subjects of a different son of heaven, weaving their own stories into the tapestry of the Gansu frontier. The status of Liqian within the administrative records of the time is remarkably specific. It was listed as a county-level entity, a designation that implies a certain level of population and importance. It is rare for a village founded by prisoners of war to be granted such formal standing. This suggests that the presence of these people was not a fleeting moment in history, but a sustained community that persisted for generations. We must wonder about the quiet integration that took place in those early decades, the way the sharp edges of Roman military life began to soften and blur as they encountered the ancient traditions of China. The clatter of iron and the rigid formations of the maniple would have slowly given way to the rhythms of the seasons, the planting of millet, the tending of livestock, and the slow, inevitable process of intermarriage. The linguistic significance of the village's name continues to haunt the edges of archaeology.
Why name a village after a city thousands of miles away, unless the people living there were the living embodiment of that distance? In the dry, preservative air of the Gansu, names have a way of outliving the people who spoke them. Even as the specific memories of Rome faded, even as the Latin tongue was replaced by the dialects of the Han, the word Liqian remained, a ghost word marking a spot on the map that refused to be forgotten. It stands as a silent witness to a time when the world was much larger and more mysterious than it is today. A time when a man could walk out of his front door in the morning and end his life in a land that his ancestors could not have even dreamed of. In the modern day, the village known as Zhelaizhai sits upon the site where Liqian is believed to have stood. To the casual observer, it looks like many other villages in the region, clusters of earth-coloured houses, narrow paths, and the timeless presence of the desert. But beneath the surface, the stratigraphy, the study of the layers of soil and debris left by human occupation, reveals a more complex story. Archaeologists digging in the area have uncovered the remains of ancient fortifications that do not fit the standard Chinese patterns of the period. There are traces of earthworks and foundations that suggest a different philosophy of defense, perhaps a lingering echo of the double palisades and the square encampments of the Roman military tradition. The people of this region, too, carry the legacy of Liqian in their very marrow. For generations, travellers have noted the unusual physical characteristics of the local inhabitants, the occasional flash of green or blue eyes, the prominence of high-bridged noses, or hair that carries a tint of auburn in the afternoon sun. These are not the typical features of the Han Chinese population. While genetic studies have provided a complex and sometimes contradictory picture, the visual evidence is a persistent mystery that refuses to be dismissed. It is as if the ghost of the legion is still trying to manifest itself, surfacing in the faces of children playing in the dust, 1,000 years after the last Roman eagle was lost to the sands. As we contemplate the founding of Liqian, we are forced to confront the limits of our own historical narrative. We often think of the ancient world as a series of isolated pockets, Rome, Persia, India, China, each existing in its own sphere with only the most tenuous of connections. But the story of this village suggests a much more porous reality.
It speaks of a world where individuals were swept up by the currents of war and trade, carried like seeds across vast distances to take root in foreign soil. The founding of Liqian was not just an administrative act by a Chinese emperor. It was a moment of profound synthesis, a place where the Silk Road became more than a route for silk and spices. It became a place where human lives were exchanged, where the far west and the far east looked into each other's eyes and found a way to coexist. There is a certain loneliness in the thought of those first settlers, standing on the ramparts of their new home, looking out toward the setting sun. They would have known that they would never see the Tiber again, never hear the roar of the Forum or feel the salt spray of the Mediterranean. They were truly lost to history, forgotten by the empire that sent them to war and absorbed by the empire that gave them a place to rest. And yet, in the naming of Liqian, they were given a kind of immortality. Their presence was recorded, their origin was acknowledged, and their arrival marked the beginning of a mystery that would endure for 2 millennia. As the quiet of the desert night settles over the Gansu province, it is easy to imagine the sounds of that ancient village, the low murmur of a language that was neither fully Chinese nor fully Latin, the clink of metal against stone, and the steady breath of a community trying to survive in a land that was not their own. The deep time of the Silk Road swallows many things, entire cities, whole languages, and the names of kings, but it has held on to the secret of Liqian with a strange tenacity. It remains a waypoint in our collective memory, a reminder that the footprints we leave behind can lead to the most unexpected of places.
We are all travellers on a long road, and sometimes the most important destination is the one we never intended to find. The story of Liqian is a story of resilience, of the way human beings can adapt to the most alien of environments and still retain a fragment of who they were. It is a testament to the fact that no matter how far we wander, we carry our origins with us, etched into the names of our towns and the features of our faces. And so the legion that vanished into the Silk Road found a new life, a new purpose, and a new name, becoming a permanent part of the landscape, a shadow moving through the long golden grass of the frontier, forever waiting to be rediscovered by those who listen to the wind. The sound of a spade striking stone in the Gansu corridor is a sound that echoes through 2,000 years of silence, a sharp note that cuts through the whistling wind of the Gobi Desert. Beneath the shifting sands and the resilient scrub brush of the Hexi corridor, the earth holds its breath, guarding secrets that do not belong to the traditional narrative of the East. As archaeologists brush away the dust of centuries, they find themselves staring at a puzzle of stone and clay that defies the local architectural vernacular. In the vicinity of Liqian, the remains of ancient fortifications begin to emerge from the stratigraphy, the layering of soil that acts as the earth's own memory. And these ruins speak a language of defense that feels strangely foreign to these longitudes. Traditional Chinese fortifications of the Han Dynasty were typically constructed using the hangtu method, a technique of rammed earth, where layers of soil were compacted between wooden shutters until they became as hard as stone. But here, amidst the golden dust, researchers have uncovered traces of something different. They find evidence of defensive structures that utilized a double enclosure system, a design reminiscent of the Roman castra, or fortified camps. These structures featured a distinct fish-scale formation of wooden palisades, a detail recorded in ancient Chinese chronicles that describes a style of defense never before seen in the region. To the trained eye, this is more than just a wall. It is a signature of a specific military culture, a way of shaping the world that was born on the banks of the Tiber and carried across the mountains of Persia. As we look closer at the artifacts recovered from these sites, the mystery deepens. Scattered among the pottery shards and iron arrowheads are remnants that whisper of a faraway home, Archaeologists have documented the presence of Roman-style motifs, including designs that mirror the laurel wreaths and geometric patterns found in the Mediterranean basin. There are fragments of glassware, translucent and fragile, created through techniques that were the pride of Roman craftsmen, appearing in a place where such luxury was a rarity. These are not merely trade goods passed from hand to hand along the Silk Road. They are found in contexts that suggest they were lived with, used, and perhaps even manufactured by those who remembered the kilns of the West. The Gansu corridor has always been a melting pot of civilizations, a narrow, fertile strip of land squeezed between the Tibetan plateau and the Gobi Desert. It served as a cosmic funnel, drawing in the weary traveler, the ambitious merchant, and the displaced soldier. Historical mapping of this region reveals a landscape that was constantly in flux, a place where the borders of empires were as fluid as the sand dunes. But the presence of these specific architectural anomalies suggests something more permanent than a passing caravan. It suggests a settlement, a deliberate attempt to recreate a lost world in a foreign land. We see this in the way the foundations are laid, in the orientation of the buildings, and in the peculiar use of stone where the local custom favored mud brick. When we apply the lens of modern archaeology, we look for the subtle clues left in the chemical composition of the soil and the microscopic remains of daily life. Radiocarbon dating, the process of measuring the decay of carbon isotopes to determine the age of organic matter, places many of these structures precisely within the window of the late 1st century before the Common Era. This was a time of great upheaval, a time when the Roman Republic was transitioning into an empire and when the Han Dynasty was reaching its furthest extent to the west. The convergence of these two titans in the Gansu corridor created a unique cultural pocket, a place where the triple fork spear of the Roman legionary might have been leaned against a wall next to the GE halberd of a Chinese guardsman. The building techniques found in these ancient ruins are perhaps the most compelling evidence of a cultural transplant. In the Mediterranean world, the use of lime mortar and specific styles of masonry were standard, while in ancient China, the focus remained on the strength of the earth itself. In the Gansu finds, we see a curious hybrid, a blending of methods where the builders seem to be adapting their ancestral knowledge to the materials available in the high desert. It is as if they were trying to speak a Roman sentence using Chinese words. The square layout of the town of Liqian itself, noted by early 20th century explorers, mirrored the rigid, grid-like precision of a Roman colonial city, a stark contrast to the more organic, winding growth of traditional Silk Road trading posts. As the years passed, these structures were weathered by the relentless winds and buried by the encroaching desert, leaving only the ghost of an outline for us to follow. But the historical mapping of the corridor shows that this was not an isolated incident. The entire region was a tapestry of influences. To walk through the Gansu corridor is to walk through a graveyard of empires, where the dust of a Greek hoplite might mingle with the silk of a Persian noble. Yet the Roman influence remains the most elusive and tantalizing thread. It is found in the way a certain arch is constructed, or in the peculiar way the locals once organized their marketplaces, favoring a central forum-like space that felt out of place in the heart of Asia. We must wonder about the hands that laid these stones. Did they ache with the memory of the Italian sun as they worked in the biting cold of a Gansu winter? Did they look at the rugged peaks of the Kilian mountains and see a distorted reflection of the Alps? The archaeology gives us the what, the stones, the glass, the strange fortifications, but it leaves the why to the imagination. It tells us that a group of people with a very specific set of skills and a very specific aesthetic arrived here and decided to stay. They built not just for survival, but for identity. They carved their presence into the earth, creating a physical record of a journey that spanned half the known world. The Gansu corridor acts as a bridge across deep time, a place where the physical evidence of the past is preserved by the very aridity that makes life there so difficult. The lack of moisture prevents the rapid decay of organic materials, allowing us to find fragments of leather and wood that would have perished elsewhere. In these fragments, we find the echoes of a legion's equipment, traces of leather straps that might have once secured a lorica segmentata, the iconic plate armor of the Roman soldier. While these finds are often fragmented and subject to intense debate among scholars, their cumulative weight suggests a narrative that mainstream history is only beginning to fully embrace. The melting pot of the Silk Road was not just a place of exchange, but a place of transformation. As we map the ancient routes, we see how the Gansu corridor functioned as a sanctuary for the displaced. The analysis of local building techniques reveals a slow, gradual assimilation. Over generations, the Roman-style fortifications were repaired with local materials, the sharp edges of the Western designs softening under the influence of Eastern aesthetics. It is a visual representation of the vanishing legion itself, the slow blending of two distinct colors until a new, unique shade emerges. The archaeology doesn't show a sudden disappearance, but a long, slow fading into the landscape. In the quiet of the desert night, when the wind drops and the stars seem close enough to touch, the ruins of the Gansu corridor feel like a silent testament to human resilience. They remind us that our history is not a series of isolated events, but a complex web of connections, many of which remain hidden beneath our feet. The discovery of these Roman-style artifacts and fortifications is a reminder that the world has always been smaller than we imagine, and that the reach of a civilization can extend far beyond its borders, carried in the minds and the crafts of those who have lost everything but their heritage. As we continue to sift through the sands of time, we are reminded of the limits of our knowledge. Every shard of glass and every carved stone is a piece of a story that we may never fully reconstruct. But the evidence in the Gansu corridor remains, a series of clues left behind by a legion that refused to be forgotten. They built their homes, they defended their walls, and they left behind a trail of breadcrumbs for us to find 2,000 years later in the golden heart of the Silk Road. And as the moon rises over the ruins of Liqian, the shadows of the past seem to lengthen, stretching out across the desert, reaching back toward a home they would never see again, yet never truly left behind. Imagine, for a moment, the steady, rhythmic sound of a stone mason's chisel echoing against the dry earth of the Gansu province, a sound that has resonated through these valleys for 2 millennia, bridging the gap between the ancient world and the present day. As we move away from the crumbling fortifications and the silent watchtowers of Liqian, we find ourselves in the quiet village of Zhelaizhai, a cluster of homes nestled against the rugged landscape where the dust of the Silk Road settles like a soft golden blanket. To the casual traveller, it might seem like any other remote settlement in western China. But as you walk through its narrow lanes and look into the eyes of the people who call this place home, the mystery of the lost legion begins to take on a living, breathing form. The shadows of history are no longer confined to the pages of dusty scrolls or the fragments of buried pottery. They are etched into the very faces of the villagers who walk these paths today. It is a striking experience to encounter the residents of Zhelaizhai, for many of them possess features that seem entirely out of place in this corner of Asia. You might see a farmer tilling his field with eyes the color of a pale morning sky, or a young girl with hair the shade of burnished copper, catching the light as she runs past sun-bleached walls. There are men with prominent, aquiline noses and thick, curly beards that would look more at home in a marketplace in Rome or a port in the Mediterranean than in a village on the edge of the Gobi Desert. These distinct Caucasian traits, the fair skin, the tall statuary frames, and the light-coloured irises, have long fascinated anthropologists and travellers alike, serving as a biological riddle that refuses to be ignored. While the surrounding populations typically exhibit the features common to the Han Chinese or the local ethnic minorities, the people of Zhelaizhai remain a visual anomaly, a pocket of the West preserved in the deep interior of the East. The villagers themselves do not view these features as a mere curiosity of genetics, but rather as a sacred inheritance. There is a profound sense of cultural pride that permeates the village, a quiet but firm identity rooted in the belief that they are the direct descendants of those wandering Westerners who arrived so many centuries ago. This is not a story they learned from modern textbooks or visiting researchers. It is an oral tradition that has been whispered from grandmother to grandchild for generations, a thread of memory that has survived the rise and fall of dynasties. They speak of ancestors who came from a land far to the west, soldiers who were lost in a great war and found their way to the protection of the Han Emperor. In their minds, the blood of the legionaries still flows through their veins, and the ghost of Rome is a constant companion in their daily lives. As the years passed, this local lore began to draw the attention of the wider world, turning the sleepy village into a focal point for a debate that blends science with legend. In the late 20th century, researchers began to conduct genetic testing, seeking to find the truth hidden within the village's DNA. They looked for markers that might link these people to the populations of Europe or the Middle East, searching for the definitive proof of a Roman migration. The results were complex and often debated, showing a mixture of East Asian and Western Eurasian lineages that suggest a long history of migration and intermingling along the Silk Road. For some, the presence of these Western markers is the smoking gun, the biological evidence of the lost legion of Marcus Crassus. For others, it is simply the natural result of centuries of trade, where merchants and travellers from all across the globe met and stayed, weaving their lives into the local fabric. Yet beyond the cold data of genetic haplogroups and chromosomal sequences, there is a felt reality in Zhelaizhai that transcends the limits of modern science. You can see it in the way the villagers have embraced their supposed Roman heritage, transforming their identity into a bridge between two worlds. There are local festivals where they dress in recreations of Roman tunics and carry wooden shields, a modern performance of an ancient memory. They have built a pavilion in the Roman style, with columns that stand in stark contrast to the traditional Chinese architecture nearby. To a skeptic, this might seem like a recent invention, a way to attract tourism or find meaning in a harsh environment, but to the people of the village, it is a reclamation of a lost past. It is a way of saying that even if the world forgot them, they did not forget who they were. The air in the village feels heavy with the weight of deep time, a sense that the present is merely a thin veil over a much older story. When you sit with the elders and listen to their stories, the technical terms of archaeology, stratigraphy, the study of soil layers, or radiocarbon dating, which measures the decay of carbon atoms to determine age, seem to fade away. Instead, you are left with the human element of history, the endurance of a people who refuse to let their origins be erased by the wind and the sand. They talk about the Westerners as if they were just here a few years ago, rather than 2000. They point to the way they carry themselves, the specific ways they prepare their food, or the unique games they play, seeing in these small details the echoes of a legionary camp. Is it possible that a group of Roman soldiers, fleeing the disaster at Carrhae and the subsequent captivity in Parthia, could have maintained their distinct identity for so long? History tells us that the Silk Road was a place of incredible fluidity, where cultures collided and merged with a frequency that we are only beginning to understand. It was a corridor of transformation, where a Greek artisan might find work in a Chinese court, or a Persian monk might settle in a mountain monastery. In such a world, the arrival of a few hundred Roman soldiers would have been a significant event, but perhaps not an impossible one.
They would have brought with them their skills, their discipline and their stories, trading the sword for the plough and the shield for the hearth. As the sun dips behind the distant mountains, casting long violet shadows across the village square, one cannot help but wonder about the nature of truth and myth. Perhaps the people of Zhelaizhai are not pure Romans in the way a historian might define it, but rather the living embodiment of the Silk Road's greatest promise, that no one is ever truly lost. They represent the blending of horizons, the moment where the Mediterranean met the Pacific in a quiet valley in Gansu. Their blue eyes and fair skin are like fragments of a mirror that was shattered long ago, reflecting a world that stretched from the Pillars of Hercules to the gates of the Han capital. The mystery of Liqian and its people remains one of those beautiful, unanswered questions that keep the past alive. It reminds us that history is not just a collection of dates and battle sites, but a tapestry of human lives, woven together by chance, survival, and the stubborn desire to belong. As the villagers of Zhelaizhai settle into the quiet of the evening, the legacy of the lost legion continues to pulse in the background of their lives. A low, steady hum like the wind through the tall grass. They are the keepers of a secret that the desert has tried to bury, a people who stand as a testament to the fact that sometimes the most enduring monuments are not built of stone, but are carried in the blood and the spirit of those who remain. And as we look closer at the artifacts they have left behind, the physical remnants of a life lived on the edge of the known world, we begin to see that the story of the lost legion is far from over. It is merely waiting for the next layer of dust to be brushed away, revealing another clue in the golden heart of the Silk Road. The cold, biting wind that sweeps across the Hexi corridor carries with it a scent of ancient dust and dry earth, a reminder that in this part of the world, the past is never truly buried. It is merely waiting for the right moment to resurface. For decades, the inhabitants of the small village of Liqian, now known as Zhelaizhai, lived their lives in the quiet rhythm of the Gansu province, largely unaware that their physical appearances were whispering a secret to anyone who cared to look. To a traveller arriving from the bustling cities of the East, the sight of these villages is often a moment of profound cognitive dissonance. Here, in the heart of China, one finds individuals with deep-set eyes of green or hazel, prominent bridge lines on their noses, and hair that shimmers with shades of auburn or flaxen yellow. These are the physical echoes of a distant land, a biological haunting that has persisted through 2,000 years of isolation. As the legend of the lost Roman legion grew from a whispered theory into a global fascination, the scientific community realized that the answers would not be found solely in the crumbling Lues walls of ancient fortifications, but in the very cells of the people who still walk these dusty streets. And so, in the early years of the 21st century, a new kind of archaeology began, one that did not use shovels or brushes, but the cold, precise tools of genomic sequencing. Scientists from Lanzhou University and other international institutions arrived in the village, seeking to map the invisible threads of ancestry that might connect these farmers to the legions of Marcus Licinius Crassus. They looked for genetic markers, those tiny, immutable signatures passed down through generations, to see if the blood of the Mediterranean truly flowed through the veins of the Gobi. The results of these DNA studies, however, did not offer the simple, triumphant clarity that many had hoped for. In 2005, and again in 2007, blood samples were taken from nearly 100 men in the village. The analysis focused on the Y chromosome, the genetic lineage passed directly from father to son, which acts as a pristine record of paternal heritage over vast stretches of deep time. The data revealed that nearly half of the villagers tested possessed genetic markers that were undeniably Caucasian in origin. There was a clear, unmistakable link to Western Eurasia,
a signature that differentiated these people from the surrounding Han Chinese populations. But as with all things in the study of the Silk Road, the truth proved to be a labyrinth rather than a straight path. While the Western markers were present, they did not point exclusively to Rome. The geneticists found a complex tapestry of DNA that suggested a more nuanced story, one of constant movement and blending along the world's oldest superhighway. The Silk Road was not a single track, but a vast, pulsing network of trade and migration that had been active for centuries before the first Roman soldier ever set foot in Asia. It was a conduit for the Tocharians, the Scythians, the Sogdians, and countless other Indo-European groups who lived, traded, and settled along the fringes of the Taklamakan Desert. The genetic data suggested that the residents of Liqian were indeed a hybrid population, but their Western ancestors could have been any number of travelers who had wandered east over the millennia. To the skeptical eye of mainstream science, the presence of green eyes and fair hair was not a smoking gun for a lost legion, but rather the expected outcome of living at a crossroads where East and West have collided since the Bronze Age. They argued that the Roman theory was a romantic projection, a case of finding what one desperately wants to see in the face of a much broader, more ancient history of human migration. Yet, for the people of Liqian, the genetic ambiguity does not dampen the power of their local identity. There is a profound tension here between the cold, statistical reality of population genetics and the living, breathing force of cultural folklore. In the village, the belief in their Roman ancestry has become a cornerstone of their communal soul. They see the DNA results not as a refutation, but as a confirmation of their distinctiveness, a proof that they are part of something older and more mysterious than the records of the local prefectures might suggest. They point to their traditional pastimes, such as a local form of bullfighting that bears a striking resemblance to ancient Mediterranean sports, or their preference for making heavy, round loaves of bread that look more like a Roman libum than a Chinese steamed bun. This debate touches upon one of the most delicate questions in the study of human history. What defines a people? Is it the precise percentage of a genetic marker, or is it the stories they tell their children, the way they shape their dough, and the memory of a long-lost home that has been preserved in their collective subconscious? The geneticists speak of haplogroups and allele frequencies, terms that describe the mechanics of inheritance, but they often struggle to capture the spirit of a population that has spent 2,000 years guarding a specific legacy. As we sift through the data, we must consider the limits of what DNA can tell us about a specific historical event. Genetic mixing over 20 centuries is like a river that has been joined by 1,000 tributaries. The original source becomes diluted, masked by the sheer volume of new water. If a few hundred Roman prisoners were settled in a frontier town, their genetic contribution would be a tiny drop in a very large ocean. Over 60 generations, those specific Roman markers would be shuffled, recombined, and in many cases lost entirely to the whims of chance. The fact that any Western markers remain at all is in itself a small miracle of persistence. Meanwhile, the landscape around Liqian continues to offer up its own silent testimony. The soil here is a pale yellowish clay that holds onto moisture and memory with equal tenacity. When the rains come, they sometimes wash away the top layer of earth to reveal fragments of pottery or the glint of a weathered coin, objects that have been tucked away in the darkness for an age. The archaeologists who work this land speak of the difficulty of stratigraphy, the science of reading the layers of the earth like the pages of a book. In a place where the wind is constantly reshaping the dunes and the rivers frequently change their course, the layers become blurred. A Roman artifact might rest inches away from a Han Dynasty tool or a medieval Mongol arrowhead, creating a jumbled narrative that defies easy categorization. This blurring of lines is perhaps the most authentic reflection of the Silk Road itself. It was a place where nothing stayed pure for long. Religions blended, languages borrowed from one another, and the very blood of the people became a map of 1,000 different journeys. To look for a pure Roman genetic signature in the 21st century is to misunderstand the nature of time and the fluidity of the human experience. The mystery of Liqian isn't necessarily that a group of Romans arrived there, but that the memory of their arrival was so potent it survived the rise and fall of dynasties, the changing of the climate, and the relentless march of modernity. And so, we are left to wonder about the nature of evidence. If the DNA is inconclusive and the archaeological record is fragmented, does the story lose its value? Or does the value lie in the very persistence of the legend? The residents of the village continue to celebrate their heritage with festivals and reenactments, donning crested helmets and carrying shields that look as though they were forged in the workshops of the Tiber. To some, this is merely a modern invention, a way to attract curious tourists and bring life back to a fading rural economy. But to others, it is an act of reclamation, a way of honouring an ancestor's journey that was so long and so arduous that it took them to the very edge of the world. As the shadows lengthen over the ruins of the old town walls, the debate between the scientists and the storytellers feels less like a conflict and more like a conversation. Both are trying to solve the same puzzle, using different languages to describe a truth that may forever remain just out of reach. The genetic mystery of the lost legion is a reminder that our past is not a static thing, locked away in a vault, but a living, changing entity that evolves with every new discovery and every new interpretation. The dust of the Silk Road is deep, and it has many more stories to tell, if we are patient enough to listen to the silence between the heartbeats of history. In the quiet, wood-panelled halls of mid-century Oxford, a singular idea began to take root, blossoming from the meticulous study of ancient texts and the flickering light of a scholar's lamp. It was 1955 when Professor Homer Dubbs, a man whose mind moved comfortably between the classical Latin of the West and the intricate characters of the East, stood before a gathering of the China Society in London. He was there to present a theory that would bridge two worlds, a hypothesis that sought to tether the ghost of a Roman legion to the dusty frontiers of the Han Dynasty. Dubbs had spent years peering through the fog of time, sifting through the Han Shu, the official history of the Han, until he found a thread that felt different from the rest. He spoke of the Battle of Zhizhi, fought in 36 before the Common Era, where Chinese scouts reported encountering a strange, highly disciplined unit of soldiers who fought with a fish-scale formation. To the ears of a classicist, this was not merely a tactical description, it was a fingerprint. It was the testudo, the tortoise formation of the Roman legionary, where shields were locked together in a seamless, impenetrable canopy. Homer Dubbs proposed that these men were the survivors of Carrhae, the remnants of Crassus's shattered dream, who had been pressed into service by the Parthians, then the Huns, and finally captured by the Chinese. He followed the trail of these wandering souls to the edge of the Gobi Desert, to a place the Chinese records called Liqian, a name that, in the phonetic landscape of the time, sounded remarkably like Alexandria or Roma. As Dubbs spoke, the weight of centuries seemed to lift, replaced by the vivid image of weary, sun-scorched Romans marching toward the rising sun, their iron armour clanking in the still air of the steppe, thousands of miles from the Tiber. It was a beautiful, haunting narrative, a story of ultimate displacement and the silent merging of civilizations. Yet, as the echoes of his lecture faded, the academic world began to respond with a measured, cautious skepticism. While the idea captured the imagination of the public, historians began to pick at the seams of the evidence, pointing out the vast, silent gaps where solid proof should have been. The reception of the Dubbs theory was a study in cultural contrast. In the West, many scholars viewed it as a fascinating but ultimately unprovable piece of historical romanticism. They argued that the fish-scale formation might have been a natural evolution of infantry tactics anywhere in the world, not necessarily a Roman invention. They questioned the linguistic gymnastics required to turn Liqian into legion or Rome, noting that ancient Chinese phonetics are a shifting sea, difficult to navigate with certainty after 2,000 years. Meanwhile, in China, the reaction was more complex. While some researchers were intrigued by the possibility of such an early, tangible connection to the West, others saw the theory as an example of Eurocentrism, an attempt to find a Western fingerprint on every unusual development in Eastern history. The historical record, they reminded us, is often a series of fragments, like a shattered ceramic vase, where most of the pieces have been swept away by the wind. To reconstruct the whole from a single shard is a task fraught with the danger of seeing what we wish to see, rather than what truly was. As the decades passed, the limitations of the Dubs theory became more apparent, even as its allure remained undiminished. The primary challenge remains the lack of contemporary Roman accounts. After the disaster at Carrhae, the Roman writers fall silent on the fate of the prisoners. There are no letters home, no inscriptions on stone, no discarded coins from the mints of Rome found in the stratigraphy, the layered history of the earth, at Liqian. In archaeology, stratigraphy is our clock, a way of reading time through the accumulation of soil and debris. But the soil of the Silk Road is notoriously restless. Sandstorms bury cities in a single afternoon, and the shifting dunes can mix the artifacts of the Han with the relics of the Tang, blurring the timeline until it becomes a shimmering mirage. Without a clear archaeological context, a Roman helmet found in a Han-era grave or a Latin inscription carved into a Gansu cliffside, the theory remains a ghost, drifting through the corridors of the what-if. The gaps in the historical record are not merely absences, they are active forces that shape our understanding of the deep past. We find ourselves staring into the long, dark tunnel of time, hoping for a glint of light that never quite arrives. Homer Dubs gave us a map, but the landmarks on that map are made of words and interpretations, not stone and bone. He relied on the Hanshu, but even ancient historians had their own agendas, their own ways of embellishing a story to please an emperor, or to make sense of a world they did not fully understand. Perhaps the fish scale formation was simply a way for a scribe to describe something he had never seen before, using the only language available to him. Perhaps the soldiers were not Romans at all, but mercenaries from a dozen different tribes, each bringing their own way of war to the great melting pot of the Central Asian frontier. And so, the academic debate continues to simmer in a state of perpetual uncertainty, a gentle fire that refuses to go out. It is a reminder that history is not a finished book, but a conversation between the living and the dead, conducted across a vast and silent distance. We look for the lost legion because we want to believe that the world has always been connected, that even in the age of horses and wooden ships, the human spirit was capable of crossing continents and leaving a trace in the blood of a distant village. But the Silk Road is a jealous guardian of its secrets. It covers the tracks of the lost with a layer of dust so thick that even the most brilliant scholar can only guess at what lies beneath. We are left with the image of Homer Dubs in his study, surrounded by the heavy scent of old paper and the ticking of a clock, trying to bridge the gap between two empires with nothing but the strength of an idea. It is a quiet, noble pursuit, a search for a truth that may be buried so deep that it has become part of the earth itself, inseparable from the stones and the silent, drifting sand. To understand the fate of these men, one must first look at the vast, invisible web that already bound their world together, a web woven not of iron or stone, but of desire and distance. Long before the first Roman soldier set foot in the parched lands of the East, and long before the first Chinese envoy looked westward toward the setting sun, there was the Silk Road. It was never a single path, but rather a circulatory system for the known world, a shifting, breathing network of mountain passes, desert tracks, and hidden oases that allowed the two greatest empires of antiquity to touch one another without ever truly meeting. They were like two giants standing on opposite shores of a dark and turbulent sea, aware of a presence on the other side but unable to discern the features of a face. The Romans called the land to the east Serica, the land of silk. To the elite of Rome, silk was more than just a fabric. It was a shimmering, translucent miracle that seemed to defy the laws of nature. They could not conceive of the humble silkworm, nor the patient hands of the weavers in the Han capital. Instead, they whispered of a mysterious people who harvested the fine white fleece from the leaves of enchanted trees. It was a trade built on layers of beautiful misunderstandings. On the other side of the world, the Chinese knew of a great power to the west called Daqin, a name that roughly translates to the Great Qin, suggesting they saw in Rome a reflection of their own imperial grandeur, a mirror image of their own civilization, existing at the very edge of the map. Between these two pillars of humanity lay thousands of miles of some of the most unforgiving terrain on the planet. And yet, the goods flowed. Spices from the humid islands of the south, frankincense from the deserts of Arabia, and the heavy golden coins of the Roman treasury moved hand to hand, culture to culture. This was an indirect exchange, a game of whispers played across a continent. A bolt of silk might change owners 20 times, passing through the hands of Sogdian merchants, Parthian horsemen, and nomadic tribes before it finally draped the shoulders of a Roman senator. In this way, ideas travelled as stowaways on the backs of camels, a mathematical concept, a technique for glassblowing, or a story of a distant god would drift slowly across the steppe, arriving at its destination centuries later, its origins forgotten, its form subtly altered by the journey. In such a world, the lost legion of Marcus Crassus represents the most extreme form of this connectivity. If the theory holds true, these men were not merely goods or stories being traded, they were the living, breathing, human element of the Silk Road. They were a fragment of the Mediterranean world that had been broken off and swept away by the current, carried further and further into the unknown, until they reached a place where the stars themselves must have looked different in the night sky. We often think of the ancient world as a collection of isolated pockets, but the Silk Road reminds us that the earth has always been a place of restless movement. The borders we draw on maps are often porous, and the tides of history have a way of carrying people far beyond the limits of their own imagination. As the years passed, the contact between Rome and China became more deliberate, though no less fraught with difficulty. We have records of Roman glass found in Chinese tombs, and Chinese chronicles that mention the arrival of envoys claiming to represent a ruler named Andun, whom historians believe was none other than the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. These emissaries arrived by sea, navigating the treacherous waters of the Indian Ocean to reach the southern ports of the Han Empire. They brought with them gifts of ivory and rhinoceros horn, though the Chinese officials were reportedly unimpressed, finding the offerings meagre compared to the legendary wealth they had expected from the Great Qin. It is a poignant image. These travellers, who had spent years on the waves, finally standing in the presence of the Son of Heaven, only to realize that their two worlds were still separated by a gulf of culture and expectation that no bridge could ever fully span. And yet, the lost legionaries were different. They were not diplomats or merchants protected by the sanctity of trade. They were men of war who had been swallowed by the landscape. If they truly founded the village of Liqian, they did so by necessity, weaving their own Roman identity into the tapestry of the Gansu corridor. One can imagine the quiet moments in such a life. A veteran sitting by a fire as the cold wind howls off the Gobi, telling his children stories of the green hills of Italy, or the crowded streets of Rome, places that must have seemed as mythical to them as the land of silk once did to him. Over generations, the Latin words would have softened and merged with the local dialects. The Roman eagle would have faded from the shields, and the memory of the Mediterranean would have become a ghost. A lingering trace in the shape of a nose, the color of an eye, or a peculiar way of building a wall. The Silk Road was a bridge of worlds, but it was also a place of profound loss. For every merchant who returned home with a fortune in peppercorns, there were countless others who vanished into the dust. The desert is a patient keeper of secrets. It buries the bones of the fallen and the ruins of their cities with an indifferent grace, leaving only fragments for us to find thousands of years later. When we look at the possibility of Romans in ancient China, we are looking at the very limits of what we can know about the past. We are peering into the deep time of the human story, where the lines between history and legend become blurred and indistinct. Archaeology tells us that the earth is composed of layers, what we call stratigraphy. Each layer represents a moment in time, a lived experience that has been pressed down by the weight of everything that followed. To find the truth of the lost legion, one would have to peel back these layers with agonizing care, searching for a Roman hobnail in a Han-era trench, or a fragment of Mediterranean DNA in a modern village. But even with the most advanced tools, such as radiocarbon dating, which measures the decay of carbon isotopes to tell us the age of organic matter, we are often left with more questions than answers. Science can provide us with a date or a chemical composition, but it cannot tell us what a man felt as he watched the sun rise over the Chilean mountains, thousands of miles from the home he would never see again. As the light of the Roman Empire began to flicker, and the Han Dynasty faced its own internal struggles, the Silk Road remained, a silent witness to the rise and fall of civilizations. It continued to facilitate the flow of life across the continent, indifferent to the names of the kings who sought to control it. The story of the Lost Legion is, in many ways, the ultimate Silk Road story. It is a story of total displacement, of the incredible resilience of the human spirit, and of the way our lives are interconnected in ways we can barely perceive. It suggests that the ancient world was much smaller and much more mysterious than we often give it credit for. We are left with the sense that history is not a straight line, but a vast, swirling ocean of possibilities. Somewhere in the sands of the Gobi there may still be a sign, a long-lost inscription, or a buried standard, waiting for the right moment to emerge and tell its tale. Until then, we have only the whispers of the wind and the enduring mystery of the men who marched out of the pages of Roman history and into the heart of the East. They remain a part of the landscape now, their story drifting through the centuries like the fine golden dust of the Silk Road itself, a reminder that even the most powerful empires are eventually reclaimed by the earth, leaving behind only the echoes of their passing and the eternal, shifting silence of the desert. It is the nature of a story to seek a home, to find a resting place in the fertile soil of the human mind, where it might take root and grow far beyond the constraints of mere fact. We are drawn to these gaps in the record, those shadowed corridors of time where the ink of the chronicler ran dry and the imagination was forced to take up the pen. The tale of the lost legion of Crassus persists not because of the strength of the genetic data or the clarity of the archaeological strata, but because it speaks to a fundamental part of our collective spirit. It is the archetype of the wanderer, the stranger in a strange land, the soldier who puts down his shield in a country whose stars he does not recognize and whose seasons he cannot name. There is a profound, almost melancholic beauty in the idea of a Roman centurion, thousands of miles from the marble forums of his youth, looking out over the jagged peaks of the Chilean mountains and finding a strange sort of peace in the vastness of the East. As the centuries have folded one over the other, like the layers of silk in a merchant's pack, This narrative has become a bridge across the great divide of the Eurasian continent. For a long time, the history of the world was told as two separate stories, one centering on the Mediterranean and the other on the Yellow River, two great hearts beating in isolation, separated by the immense silence of the steppes and the frozen heights of the Pamirs. But the legend of the men of Liqian suggests that the world was never truly fragmented. It whispers of a time when the edges of empires were porous, when the wind could carry the sound of a Latin command into a Chinese valley, and when the blood of distant cousins might mingle in the dust of a frontier town. We cling to this story because it softens the harsh boundaries of our maps, reminding us that even in the ancient world, the human experience was one of constant, quiet intersection. There is a romantic appeal in the resilience of these men, or at least in the version of them we have constructed. We imagine them not as defeated prisoners, but as survivors who carried the essence of their culture across the breadth of the known world. In our minds, they are the ultimate pioneers, men who lost everything they knew and yet found a way to endure, to build, and to belong. This archetype of the stranger is a mirror we hold up to ourselves, reflecting our own fears of being lost and our own hopes of being found. Whether or not they actually stood on the ramparts of a Han fortress, their journey represents the eternal movement of people, the slow, grinding drift of humanity that has shaped our species since we first walked out of the rift valleys of Africa. The Silk Road was never just a path for spices and precious stones. It was a conduit for souls, a long, dusty thread that stitched the tapestry of the world together. When we look at the villagers of modern-day Zhelaizhai, with their light-coloured eyes and their narrow noses, we are not just looking for Roman DNA. We are looking for a connection to the deep past, a tangible link to the ghosts of the 1st century before the Common Era. Science may speak of genetic drift and the complexities of the Silk Road's melting pot, using radiocarbon dating to pin down a fragment of wood, or analysing the stratigraphy, the layers of earth and debris, to date a crumbling wall. But the legend exists in a different layer of human consciousness, a layer that is not easily reached by the spade or the microscope. To the people who live there, the story is a source of identity, a way of rooting themselves in a history that spans the entire globe. It is a reminder that we are all, in some way, the descendants of travellers, the children of those who dared to cross the next horizon. The power of this legend lies in its refusal to be fully solved. If we were to find a definitive Roman helmet tomorrow, or a cache of Latin inscriptions buried beneath the Loess Plateau, the mystery would be over. And with it, some of the magic would fade. It is the uncertainty that keeps the story alive, the way it hovers just at the edge of our vision, like a mirage on the desert floor. In the quiet hours of the night, as the wind howls through the narrow passes, it is easy to imagine the rhythmic tread of heavy sandals on the packed earth, or the glint of a bronze eagle caught in the moonlight. These are the echoes of a world that was much larger and more mysterious than our own, a world where a man could march off the edge of the map and into the realm of myth. As we contemplate the fate of the lost legion, we are forced to confront the limits of what we can truly know about the past. History is a fragmented thing, a collection of shards and whispers salvaged from the wreckage of time. For every king whose name is carved in stone, there are 10,000 soldiers whose names have been swallowed by the earth. For every battle recorded in the annals of a palace, there are 1,000 quiet lives lived in the shadows of the great events. The men of the lost legion represent those forgotten thousands. They are the symbols of the anonymous masses who moved across the earth, carrying their languages, their gods, and their memories into the unknown. They remind us that the true history of the world is not just a list of dates and dynasties, but a vast, interconnected web of human stories,
most of which will never be told. And so, the legend endures, drifting through the centuries like the fine, golden dust of the Silk Road itself. It bridges the gap between the East and the West, between the ancient and the modern, and between the facts we can prove and the truths we can only feel. It is a story of survival, of adaptation, and of the enduring power of the human spirit to find a home, even in the farthest reaches of the world. As the years continue to pass, and the ruins of Liqian sink deeper into the soil, the men who marched there remain a part of the landscape, their memory a gentle, persistent presence in the silence of the desert. They are a reminder that even the most powerful empires are eventually reclaimed by the earth, leaving behind only the echoes of their passing and the eternal, shifting mystery of the road that leads toward the rising sun.
A single copper coin, worn smooth by the friction of 1,000 years, rests beneath a layer of fine yellow loess. Its Latin inscriptions long ago surrendered to the patient grinding of the wind. It is a small thing, a fragment of a world that once stretched from the mist-heavy forests of Britain to the sun-bleached columns of the Roman Forum, and yet here it lies, thousands of miles from the Tiber, cradled in the palm of a desert that does not remember the name of Caesar. We often think of history as a series of distinct maps, neatly coloured shapes that represent the boundaries of what was known and what was unknown, but the story of the Lost Legion suggests that these maps were always more porous than we imagine. The world has always been interconnected by the restless feet of those who had no choice but to keep moving, and by the quiet, steady pulse of trade and war that pushed the edges of the horizon further back with every passing generation. As we look back on the long road these men travelled, from the chaotic, blood-soaked fields of Carrhae to the high, thin air of the Pamir Mountains, we find ourselves wondering what they thought of as they lay down to sleep in the shadow of the Great Wall. Did they still dream of the smell of pine trees on the Appian Way, or the sound of the Mediterranean waves crashing against the limestone cliffs of home, or did those memories eventually fade, like a reflection in a disturbed pool, until the only reality was the vast, undulating sea of grass and the strange, beautiful calligraphy of a landscape they were never meant to see? There is a certain weight to this kind of distance, a gravity that pulls at the soul when one realizes that the road back has been swallowed by time and tide. They were men of the eagle and the short sword, trained for a style of warfare that relied on the rigid strength of the phalanx and the unwavering discipline of the line, yet they were forced to become something else, something fluid, survivors in a land that demanded a different kind of strength. The legacy they left behind is not found in grand monuments or triumphal arches, but in the subtle genetic whispers that some believe still linger in the villages of Gansu province. It is found in the green eyes of a farmer tilling the soil, in the high bridge of a nose that seems out of place among the local features, and in the peculiar traditions of a community that once built square forts and practiced the art of the testudo, the tortoise formation, long after the Roman Empire had crumbled into the dust of the West. While modern science utilizes the tools of stratigraphy, the study of soil layers that act as a timeline of human occupation, and radiocarbon dating to pin these events to a specific century, there remains a limit to what the physical evidence can tell us. Archaeology can give us the bones and the pottery. It can show us the charcoal of a campfire or the iron of a spearhead, but it cannot capture the loneliness of a century watching the moon rise over the Gobi Desert, knowing he is the furthest his people have ever ventured into the dark. And so, the story of the Lost Legion remains one of history's most enduring mysteries, a quiet bridge between two great civilizations that barely knew of each other's existence. At one end of the Silk Road sat Rome, a city of marble and law, convinced it was the center of the universe. At the other end sat the Han Dynasty, a sophisticated empire of silk and philosophy holding the same conviction. Between them lay a distance so vast it felt like the space between stars. And yet, through the movements of these wandering soldiers, that space was briefly crossed. They were the accidental explorers, the unintended ambassadors who carried the spirit of the West into the heart of the East, not through choice, but through the simple human desire to endure. The sands of the desert are a patient guardian. They bury what is forgotten and preserve what is lost, waiting for the right moment to reveal a secret. Perhaps there are still camps buried deep beneath the dunes, where the leather of a Roman sandal remains intact in the dry heat, or where a discarded helmet sits filled with the dust of centuries. We may never have the definitive proof that every historian craves, the perfect inscription or the undisputed record. But perhaps the mystery itself is more valuable. It reminds us that the human story is much larger than the records we keep, that for every battle written down in the annals of kings, there are 10,000 individual journeys that went unrecorded, 10,000 lives that left their mark in ways we are only just beginning to perceive. As the years pass and the ruins of the village of Liqian continue to settle into the earth, the echoes of those marching boots grow softer, but they do not disappear entirely. They are part of the wind now, part of the long, slow rhythm of the Silk Road that has seen empires rise and fall like the seasons. The journey from the streets of Rome to the edges of the Gobi was not just a physical trek. It was a transformation, a merging of worlds that redefined what it meant to be a stranger in a strange land. Those who never returned to the Tiber found a different kind of peace, a quiet resting place in the vastness of the East, where the sun rises earlier and the stars seem to hang just a little bit closer to the ground. In the deep time of our planet, the span of a human life is but a flicker, and even the lifespan of an empire is only a brief moment in the long silence of the desert. We find comfort in these stories because they speak to our own persistence, our ability to adapt and survive even when we are cast out into the unknown. The lost legionaries were not just soldiers. They were travelers on a road that had no end, and their memory serves as a gentle reminder that no matter how far we wander, we are always part of a larger tapestry, a story that began long before us and will continue long after the last of our footprints have been swept away by the sand. As the night deepens and the world grows still, we can imagine the campfire light flickering against the walls of a distant outpost, the smell of wood smoke mixing with the cooling air of the high plains. The men are resting now, their shields leaned against the stone, their long journey finally over. The road back to Rome has faded into the twilight, but the road they are on now is one of eternal peace, a path that leads through the heart of history and into the quiet embrace of the earth. We leave them there, in the golden light of the desert, where the secrets of the past remain safe, tucked away in the shifting dunes, under the watchful gaze of the ancient stars. The silence of the Gobi is vast, and in that silence, the story of the lost legion lives on, a whisper of iron and silk, a memory of a home far away, and a testament to the enduring mystery of the long road home.